So this is now part 4 of my progression of the Simplified Object project. I'm holding up my little compositional rough, my prototype like this, because if it lays flat, you have that really nice glare from the overhead lights. So I just want you to see it like this. Now, as the videos progress, again, this is part 4, they do get shorter, thankfully. So the whole bulk of the drawing and the shape designing and the thinking through what shapes should have what values was pretty much done in parts 1 through 3. Part 3, which was just before this, was me fleshing out, let me get all of my parts here, me fleshing out what numbered values should be in what shapes. So if you remember, parts 1 was me just drawing everything with its basic outline, the hand, the proportions of the fingers, and how they react with the outlines and the edges of the ice cream cone. Part 2 was then me shape designing, segmenting those shapes of value based on the source. This is my source. So we're looking at the lights and the shadows and the midtones, and we're segmenting things into good shape design and then assigning numbers to them. And that was what I was doing on part 3. I was talking through where to put the numbers, those things to think about when putting the numbers, and having a little scale off to the side. I just drew a very basic one here on my tracing paper. It'll be easier to maybe do it on a piece of printer paper or just some scrap paper or a note card. Having 6 values, you've got 3 in the lights, 3 in the darks. Now, that was what I initially set out to do. I've got this value progression. Your value jumps do not need to be even. They can be, like, you can have 1 through 4 be all light, and then to value compress the lights from the darks, you can then have 2 dark values of a 5 and a 6 if you wanted to. Just to start me off though, I was just thinking in terms of even value jumps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, from 1 to 6, 6 being dark, 1 being white of the page. And so after putting all of that down, I then went to the photocopy machine and I have this result. I photocopied this at 75% ratio. So therefore it has shrunk a little bit. Okay, so this is the actual drawing. So I put the actual tracing paper in the copy machine. I scaled it down to be 75% of the original. And this is what came out. And this is a super important step, and that's what I want to talk about. This step is getting a smaller photocopy, smaller just so you're not like spending a ton of time. You should be focusing on rendering the project, but this is still the thinking and the figuring out and the problem solving stage. So on a slightly smaller scale than my drawing, I wanted to have something I could actually fill in with values because numbers only do so much. I know that I have my numbers segmented, 1 is white of the page, 6 is super dark as I can get it with my pencils. But I'm just assigning values where I think they need to go based on what I know their association to be. So I think with this 4, I think that needs to be a dark midtone. So I just put that down there. Now, when I have all these numbers and I have this printout, I then can fill it out actually with those values. And that's what I was showing at the very beginning of this video. Looks pretty cool, right? Okay, so it looks really neat. You can see that a lot of the values that I assigned worked out very well. Again, thinking it through, that's why you should be thinking with all of these stages. It's almost like the part that you have to think the least amount is the actual rendering of the project, because you should be thinking in all the preliminary steps before that. So I have my 2s and my 1s. Now, something that did kind of throw me off is I did not lighten my pencil lines before I photocopied, which was a good thing because I wanted to see like all of those lines in the photocopy. However, the numbers might have been helpful maybe to lighten a little bit because I have this 1 here. It's the white of the page, so I didn't put any value in there, but it just kind of threw me off just with the coherence of how nice it could look. I'm seeing that glaring number there, but that's okay. It's not a big deal. Same with the 2, like I can see like the actual value of my letter form of the 2, or that number form of the 2 is like actually darker than the value that's put in that shape. So it throws me off just a little bit, but it's really not that bad. So this is now the stage when I fill in my values with all of the numbers. Notice that off on the side, I do have a nice little value scale. Always put off to the side a value scale so that it's one that you create on your own, that you associate numbers with, so that you can always bring this and judge, how dark or how light do I need to go. So that's me folding and comparing different values. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and then 1 is the white of the page, so I just didn't even put anything down for that. when I was rendering this, I thought of some really good tips to maybe help you. So I was writing them down as notes here off to the side. First of all, I wanted to just mention that this is me still problem solving to see if values are labeled correctly. I did the best I could with my numbers. Now I'm seeing how it all works together, and I discovered I had some numbers right next to each other. And I'll show you, I didn't notice this until I did the value study, that prototype off to the side. I have a 6 right here, and notice I have these 6s off on the side here within the cone, which renders that edge gone, this edge gone, like there's no contrast. Those shapes are going to bleed right into each other. And that's what happened. So I took my pencil, you can see that super dark 6, and it just bled right into those shapes. Honestly though, we're not losing anything. Like, it worked out that those shapes bled together because we could simplify it and it still works. From far away, from up close, we can still tell where the edge of the ice cream cone is, precisely because of this dark mid-tone. You could call it like a light shadow. That 5 is still like stopping and starting right there. So we're still getting what we need, but that was something I noticed. There was another emergence of values that I forget where it was. It might have been somewhere in the ice cream itself. But I just discovered as I'm filling in the values to the numbers, oh, I didn't realize that I had some numbers that were the same right next to each other. So that is something that's very helpful. This stage, this step is imperative. You cannot skip this because you don't want to be rendering your project and discover that you messed up on something or that you had numbers that were close to each other that should have been separated. Also, it's key to understand maybe what values would be better assigned to places. Like I discovered here, if I were to compare this to the source, notice that how I have, because remember, we're distilling this, we're simplifying this into values. This has tons of values. We can only use 6 right here. So notice that the hand, as cool as it is, we have this value here that's pretty light. Honestly, I don't mind that. You can have values that are actually lighter than what you see in the source as long as you're following the form principle. We still have light side as it cascades into shadow side. It still looks like it's form. It still looks like a believable hand. Even though the lights here in the hand are technically in my drawing darker than what's here, that's okay. But something that I thought might actually be a better solution for the hand would be to put a really dark, like a 5 actually in here. That would allow the edge of the cone to retain those 6s, and we can see that this might be a nice 5. I don't know if we need to necessarily have this be a 6. I know in my previous video I said, this can't not be a 6. But the more I look at it, the more I feel like, oh, maybe I could choose to make that a 5 because we have a lot of 5 here anyways. So maybe that's something that we could do. And then we can just reserve the 6 for the wrist area. I'm looking at everything else here. If there's any other modifications, any new number assignments, this is going to be the stage where you're going to want to figure that out and analyze that. Everything else worked out pretty well. There were a couple of shapes that had a 5 right next to a 6, like right here. This over here was a 5 and this was a 6. I thought, you know what? Forget that. I'm just going to merge them together to be just a 6. Same thing up here. I had a 5 up here and a 6 right here. I actually kept that the same. So that is a little bit lighter and that is darker. You can keep that the same because this is a marking rather than actual form, like it's the actual marbling of the ice cream flavor in there. You might be able to just combine that to be just one solid 6. So to see the values right up next to each other is very helpful to get you to understand if you need to merge something together. There's another one in the fingers. I had a separation. I had like 2 different, I think it might have been here. I had like a 5 somewhere in here and then a 6. I just merged that to be all one 6, like all one whole cohesive 6 value. Same thing down there. So there were some values even around the finger forms as it hits the ice cream cone. So especially the tips of the fingers, I thought, you know what, let's just simplify that. It'll make it a bolder, stronger impact to separate the fingers from the cone that it's wrapping around, to just have just one cohesive dark shape that helps to separate that. Something else that might be helpful, I have this as a 1 right there for the ice cream cone, but these lights on the fingers are a 2. I think the lights on the fingers remaining a 2 is still fine, but this looks like it's too bright when I compare it. It's like, well, why is this a 1? Shouldn't then these be 1s? So if I'm going to remain these, or if I'm going to keep these to be 2s, then that should probably be a 2 as well, and I would just do a very light value like that. So some excellent problem solving that happens at this stage. It did not take me long. That's why we photocopy it slightly smaller, not too small so you can't see details or can't get a good reading, but smaller than your project just for the sake of time. Some of the notes that I took off to the side, 4H is a good 2. So remember 4H is your hardest pencil probably with the graphite in there. And so if white of the page is 1, then that very next super light gray would probably be a 4H. And I was able to get a good result of that. I did this quickly. You can still see my line work, but as long as it's even, texture's not bad. You can always dab that up, but ultimately this would still work fine. A B makes a good 4. This was something else I discovered. If I clumped 4, 5, and 6 close together, they all, when I would squint, they all seem to bleed together. 5 and 6, I actually had a hard time sometimes keeping separate when I was rendering it with my pencils. So I discovered that it's actually helpful, and this is why earlier when I was looking at my tracing paper, I mentioned that originally I was thinking through this in terms of equal value steps. But now, because I did this step and I'm rendering it following my numbers, I've discovered if this is a 1 just filled in with white, you've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's actually better for me, at least as I was rendering, to think of all of these 1 through 4 in the lighter side, and then 5 and 6 be that segment where it's in the shadow side. I was able to get better value contrast between my 4 and my 5. So here, for example, I had my 5 in the lattice here of the cone. 6s are in between. 6s are those little cells of squares. 5 is around here. We then get to a part of the mid-tone part of the cone, so I segment that off with my shapes. This was a 4, so these lattice lines are a 5, these are a 4. When I originally put this in, the 4 was so dark that it was hard for me to tell that that was actually a change in the value of the cone as it's wrapping around. So I lightened my 4 by erasing what I had and using my B pencil to make a nice, just a basic middle of the road mid-tone. That worked out very well. It separated itself enough from the 5 that I didn't have any issues. HB makes a really good 3. The difference between HB and B doesn't seem that drastic with the pencils as far as how they're labeled, because B is bold or black and then HB is like hard black or hard bold. So, I wasn't sure what my result would be, but HB actually, remember, the HB is the same as your pencil with the graphite is in your mechanical pencil. So I actually just filled in my 3s with my mechanical pencil. And you notice, you can even see, so this is a 3 right here, how that would look next to a 4. Like that separation is really nice. We have 1 step up in value for the 3, but there's enough value separation for contrast that works out so nice. I used my 4B for my 6. I used my 3B for my 5. That's just what I did, and certainly 1 is the white of the page. So those are just my helpful tips on what I used. So 2, I mentioned 4H. 3 is a good HB, 4 is B. So 3B for my 5 and 4B or darker for my 6. Now each pencil quality with brand might be a little bit different. I'm using Staedtler Mars Lumograph. I really like the Staedtler brand. And they just happen to have a very nice, good quality dark pencils, even with their 4B, which is why I was able to get my darkest dark even with a 4B. Depending on your pencil brand, because there's also just other good pencil brands, you might just have to test that out. What does actually get you your darkest dark? It might need to be your 6B or your 8B, whatever you have there. So this is the end result for my rough. What I can do now, I did transfer I took my tracing paper to the light table and I transferred all my lines. I'm going to slightly lighten these lines. And I am going to not put numbers down. What I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to follow along. I have 2 things at my disposal. I have my tracing paper with my numbers that I'll have right next to it. So I actually have 3 things at my disposal. I have my copy that doesn't have any rendering. So I did copy this twice. So I've got 2 photocopies, one that I rendered, one that I kept free. So this has numbers on it. So it's basically the same thing as my tracing paper. But then I also have this, which is my little rough prototype. So I don't need to put numbers here. I can just start rendering exactly where I see those shapes need to go. But keep in mind, follow this as well as the source, because this was where I discovered where values needed to merge even more than I thought. So like in the fingers where the 5 and the 6 actually should just merge into a 6, make sure that I'm following along on the prototype, like, okay, yeah, I'm just going to fill in that shape with just one long 6 value instead of separating a 6 and a 5 value. I'm going to try to actually put in with this. Notice that I have that shape combined. But because I think this might do better as a 5, I'm going to just put in a 5. and then these will remain a 6, just like that. And so I'm going to see how that goes. I can test that out here on my project without fully doing a new prototype, because if I need to go darker, because remember, I'm testing out the lighter one. If it turns out that doesn't work, I can always go back over it with more graphite and make it a 6 very easily. It's going to be harder to go too dark and then have to lighten just because you're dealing with blotchiness and things like that. It's easier to think of it, maybe it should be lighter, discover, oh, it needs to go darker, and then darken it. It's always easier to darken than it is to lighten. But this now is the end of my phase 4. Phase 5 is filling this out. So I'm going to off screen fill this out in all the correct values. Again, my 1 through 6. In last thought, something else that you probably noticed that I wrote here. Perhaps think of it like 1 through 5 and then 6 is a special punch value. What I mean by that is, what I discovered as I'm rendering this, filling in those numbers, it might be helpful to actually think of everything as just in terms of 5 values, 1 through 5, being dark all the way to white. And then 6 being that special punched dark to where you really need that nice element of contrast. So I have a 6 that wraps around the corners of these squares, and that really helps get that square to look like it's punching in to the actual surface area of the waffle, making it the waffle cone. I have some nice 6s that are punched into the ice cream to showcase where we really have a nice overlapping of melting or liquid kind of ice cream that's flowing over and overlapping other things. So this would be a good reason, why I was thinking maybe this should be a 5, to really reserve a 6 to be for these darkest areas in here. I'm even considering lightening the values here of the fingernail. Because we're simplifying this, this person's hand doesn't look like the fingernail and the thumb is any different of a color than the fingernails, here. But on mine, because I had to just simplify values, it does kind of look like these fingernails in value, they're just so much lighter than the thumb. Even though this part of the hand is in shadow, it almost looks like their fingernail and the thumb is painted black or something. So I'm actually thinking about lightening these values as well, just for sake of aesthetics, to make it all seem cohesive. So that again would be another reason to not do a 6 right there, but to maybe have 6 just reserved for those special punches of dark where I really need to see a crease and a fold, which would be here in the fingers, or even here where those waffle texture squares are like punched in, or where an ice cream portion or like an ice cream substance is like flopping over, folding over something else.